This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. This is the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting from the Sundance Film Festival in Park City, Utah. In South Dakota, the Republican-controlled House passed a bill Wednesday that criminalizes gender-affirming surgery for transgender youth. The bill, which sailed through the House by a 2-to-1 margin, would make it a felony for doctors to provide anyone under the age of 16 with puberty blockers, hormones, and other transition-related health care. Medical professionals who provide this care could face up to 10 years in prison. Parents and health professionals say the bill will take away life-saving treatments for transgender youth. This came the same week a South Dakota lawmaker introduced 2 more anti-trans bills into the legislature, the latest of more than 25 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced around the country this year. As this assault on transgender lives takes place in South Dakota and across the country, we turn to a groundbreaking film that just premiered here at the Sundance Film Festival. It's called Disclosure: Trans Lives on Screen. The documentary examines the depiction of transgender people in television and film for more than a century, from the 1914 silent film of Florida Enchantment to the Oscar-winning 1999 film Boys Don't Cry to the new hit television series Pose. Through in-depth interviews with transgender actors, activists, and writers, the documentary reveals the way Hollywood and the media both manufacture and reflect widespread misunderstandings and prejudices against trans people. The film also champions the trans people in film and television who have fought and are fighting tirelessly for accurate and dignified representation on screen. In this clip from the beginning of Disclosure, we first hear the voice of the legendary transgender actress and activist Laverne Cox.
I never thought I'd live in a world where trans people would be celebrated on or off the screen.
Thank you so much for this moment.
I never thought the media would stop asking horrible questions.
How do you hide your peanuts?
And start treating us with respect.
You kept it quiet because you said you didn't want to become othered.
Now, look at how far we've come.
We have so much more representation in government, in media.
We are everywhere.
And you never know what those positive images do for other people. You never know.
For the first time, trans people are taking center of their own storytelling.
At this point where we're talking really about unprecedented trans visibility.
That's my sister!
Look at me! Trans people are being murdered disproportionately still.
That's the paradox of our representation is the more we are seen, the more we are violated.
The more positive representation there is, the more confidence the community gains, which then puts us in more danger.
I go into the women's restroom, then I've committed a crime. If I go in the men's restroom, then everybody knows.
I think all of us in the community have had those moments of being like, is this going to somehow alienate people who aren't ready yet?
Why is it that trans issues have become like a front and center issue in the culture wars?
I think capitalizing on people's fear is what has landed us in this moment right now. And you have hope on one side and fear on the other.
I think for a very long time, the ways in which trans people have been represented on screen have suggested that we're not real, have suggested that we're mentally ill, that we don't exist. And yet, here I am, yet here we are, and we've always been here.
That's trans actress Laverne Cox with the clip from Disclosure: Trans Lives on Screen. Well, this week we spoke with the film's director, Sam Feder, and 2 of the documentary's subjects, actress Jen Richards, Emmy Award-winning director Yance Ford. They were here in Park City, Utah for the world premiere of Disclosure. I began by asking director Sam Feder why he decided to take on this subject years ago.
Okay, well, first, thank you for having me here. I think maybe the one thing that I'd be more excited about than having a Sundance premiere is being on the show. So thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. So what made me decide to make this film? You know, I think 2014, Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine. And I remember seeing her in this beautiful blue dress, and the headline read "The Transgender Tipping Point." And there was all this celebration around that. And when I looked off the page in the real world, that was not the reality. Something really felt amiss with that. You know, trans people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than the rest of the population, 4 times more likely if you're a trans person of color. We're witnessing an epidemic of trans women being murdered, particularly black trans women. The suicide rates for trans men are surging. So that's the reality that I was witnessing and living in. So I was trying to reconcile these 2 things happening at the same time, right? The rise of visibility and the rise of social and legislative violence. So I wanted to look at the legacy of those images to understand how we got there and to understand how to use this excitement around positive visibility to, you know, work on pushing back against the legislation that's trying to legislate us out of existence.
And why did you call the film Disclosure?
I think one of the most ubiquitous tropes about us is the need to disclose, right? That the onus is on us to reveal something about us that is a secret that no one else knows, that we're using, you know, to deceive, we're using to get to something, and that we have something to disclose, as if not everyone has information that doesn't need to be shared. Jen talks about it really beautifully in the film, how, you know, it's the idea of disclosure is really prioritizing someone else's experience over your own. So that is such a rampant notion in most trans people's minds, and most conversations around trans lives is the idea of disclosure. And so just that's why I wanted to call it that.
And how does it feel to be premiering this at the Sundance Film Festival, where there are so many Hollywood gatekeepers? If you can describe that, and then also give us a sort of a history in a nutshell of representation.
I mean, it's thrilling for me, you know, to be here with all the Hollywood gatekeepers. As a documentarian, like, you get to explore these issues with such nuance and time, as opposed to the actors who want to get work, you know, and want to, you know, speak their truth, but also want to have a career. And so I'm thrilled to be able to be the one to push back and explain how violent these images are. And the fact that they might be heard by the gatekeepers is incredibly exciting. So that's the goal.
The history in a nutshell.
The history in a nutshell. What was so amazing about doing this research was finding clips actually from like the 1890s, right? I think the first clip we show in the film is from 1901, and it's from one of the Edison production houses where he was doing these screen tests, and you see a female impersonator of the time wearing a wig and, you know, kind of just dancing around. I think it's actually one of the first on-screen kisses. Is that how you say it? First on-screen kiss we see. And so I was really taken aback by how, you know, this idea of transgressing gender has been a plot device since the beginning of celluloid, and how it's so ingrained in the DNA of film. And you see that sort of imagery of putting a man in a dress as a joke evolve from making fun of women to making fun of gay men to then a stand-in for trans women. There's this film from the Florida Enchantment, this film called The Florida Enchantment from 1914, and there you start to see how gender transgression and racism have been so also deeply intertwined together and embedded in our film history.
And right around that time, Yance Ford is Birth of a Nation, and you go into this, Sam, in Disclosure, the horrific racist film that was premiered at the White House under President Wilson.
Yeah, what's remarkable is D.W. Griffith is sort of this embodiment of, you know, the beginnings of just sort of massacring the reality of what it means to be black in America, what it means to be trans in America. He takes the most vulnerable populations, the most vulnerable people, and turns them into devices for his narrative pleasure. for, to reinforce the predatory black man, and then to on top of that, morph the trans body into something that is, object of ridicule, to be laughed at by us all, but also to be discarded, to be thrown away, and I think that anyone would have gotten to, the first jump cut to, advance the story in film. It's a great, editing moment in the history of film. But I also think that the fact that we don't talk about how problematic the images that he created are helps to perpetuate those images. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so glad that disclosure exists now, because it really forces people to look. And I think that for so long, people, just have consumed images without thinking about what they're seeing. And disclosure really makes you think about what you're watching in a way that, in my experience of watching the film for the first time, helps to undo all of those stereotypes, and all of that damage begins to, sort of turn back upon itself and turn into something that is, potentially healing.
I mean, Birth of a Nation became a major recruiting film for the Ku Klux Klan.
It still is. It still is.
I want to turn to another clip from Disclosure. This begins with the actress and writer Bianca Lee.
As a trans person, you have the most sensitive radar to tell the difference between you're laughing with us.
In the phone book, you were listed as F. DeVoe.
The F stands for Frank Hunt. That's me.
Or you're laughing at us.
This is the men's room.
I know. I'm a dude.
Trans jokes? Really?
Hello, Joel. I'm Jackie.
Most of us have a good sense of humor. We've had to have a good sense of humor.
Why am I being arrested? I told you, it's called an unclassified misdemeanor.
But we don't want to be the butt of jokes.
Oh, wait a minute. I forgot something.
What?
Can you talk like a woman?
You be like this?
Well, that's awful. Can't you do better than that?
No.
Every trans person carries within themselves a history of trans representation, just in terms of what they've seen themselves.
Coop. Dennis?
Why don't you live with me and I'll be your wife?
What trans people really need, though, is a sense of a broader history of that representation, so that they can kind of find themselves in it.
That clip from the new trans life documentary that has just premiered at the Sundance Film Festival called Disclosure, that was actress and writer Jen Richards, one of the stars of the Netflix show Tales of the City and the primetime Emmy-nominated 2016 web series Her Story, which Richards also co-created. Jen, it's great to have you with us. I'm a real fan of your work. Continue what you're saying in this clip.
There is a lack of historical context for trans people, which we actually see in the legislation as well. There's this notion that it's a new phenomenon, that trans people are a sudden trend that need to be combated, because we have this continual historical forgetting. We don't know our own past. We don't know that we've been around, because we don't get to see those images. What Sam's film really does is situate us today in a historical legacy. I think a lot about one specific idea, just this notion of who gets to play trans people on screen. And I heard so many times from producers in Hollywood that, well, we have to put, this particular star, this man, to play this trans woman in order to get the film made and push the conversation forward. And one of the moments that we discuss in the film is that this practice has been going on, for over 40 years. And so it's just this ahistorical reading.
So let's talk about some of these films. And some of these films, as Sam brings us in Disclosure, were considered groundbreaking, especially around trans life. You had The Crying Game of 1992. You had Boys Don't Cry of 1999. But talk about what you felt was so critical, why they were such a turning point, but also problematic.
I mean, The Crying Game's a wonderful example. I love that film. It's an absolutely beautiful film. There was something incredibly galvanizing and exciting about seeing that character on screen because it was someone I could identify with. But there's also a profound...
And can you, for people who haven't seen it, in a nutshell?
Well, I think, are we allowed to spoil Crying Game now? It's been some 20 years. Yes. A character falls for and starts dating this showgirl that he sees, and in the moment of her disrobing as they're about to have sex, he realizes, that she has a penis and is therefore really a man, and his response is to, flee to the bathroom and aggressively vomit. And then this trope of men vomiting in response to the disclosure of a trans body has been repeated endlessly in Ace Ventura and Family Guy over and over again. And for trans people ourselves, those images just get placed in our brains and are really hard to dislodge. I've dated men for many years, and that image was always running through my mind. Every time I went to disclose to someone that I was trans, that's the image in my head is of a man responding. And
vomiting.
Vomiting, yeah, at the reality of my body, that's an appropriate and common response, because that's the only response I had ever seen was on screen. and so that's what I'm taught. And that's what the men are taught, that that's an appropriate reaction. That's what the whole world is taught is an appropriate reaction, that I'm a legitimate object of disgust. There is also the fascination with the trans body, and that's the part that I can at least identify with in a somewhat positive way. There's a certain glamour and beauty on screen as well, but it's always coupled with this violent reaction.
And Boys Don't Cry?
I mean, there's a similar dual consciousness. I hear this over and over again from trans men in particular. There's an excitement and a thrill and a deep sense of identification with seeing a trans character on screen who is operating fully and openly in his masculinity and enjoying his maleness. But then again, it's coupled with a violent rape and a homicide, a murder. And so we could never
have... Of course, that is based on a real story of Brandon Tina.
Exactly, and we carry those stories with us all the time. That's what we're thinking of all the time as we move through the world. And so we have this dual consciousness from these images.
So if you could talk about who plays trans people on television and in film.
One of the biggest issues I've had with the way that Hollywood has represented trans people is that it's very, very common for Hollywood to cast cis men as trans women and cis women as trans men. And in so doing, they're always reinforcing this notion that at the end of the day, the trans person is really the gender that they were assigned at birth rather than who they actually are in the world. And for the most part, it's a narrative trope. It's a dramatic device because the disclosure itself is considered so dramatic, and there's this notion of deception that always runs through it. But then there's this additional layer that we talk about in the film where when we lavish awards and attention and praise onto the actors doing this for this incredible transformational act that they do on screen, we're also continually seeing those actors in their assigned gender. We're seeing Jared Leto, we're seeing Jeffrey Tambor and Eddie Redmayne and Hilary Swank, which again reinforces in the minds of the public that a trans person is really, that gender.
Hilary Swank, of course, for Boys Don't Cry, and Eddie Redmayne for The Danish Girl. Mm-hmm. Talk about The Danish Girl.
I mean, The Danish Girl, I have very complicated feelings about it. I think it's a really lovely film. I worked with Eddie a little bit, and he's a wonderful actor, and he took the role very seriously, and I thought he found some really beautiful moments. And the film did open up the idea of trans people to many people who wouldn't have otherwise known. I've known many trans people whose parents loved The Danish Girl, and I think who that movie is made for. But again, when we see Eddie being awarded for his performance in that film, we're still seeing a man in his tuxedo who is getting that award.
We continue our conversation about the new film Disclosure, Trans Lives on Screen, with actress Jen Richards, Oscar-nominated director Yance Ford, ACLU lawyer Chase Strangio, and the film's director Sam Feder. I asked Sam to talk about depictions of trans men on screen, beginning with the 1999 Oscar-winning film Boys Don't Cry. Sam Feder, take it from there in the films that you show, specifically trans men being portrayed in television and on the silver screen.
I mean, when we were talking about Boys Don't Cry, I think what's problematic with Boys Don't Cry is that it is a true story, and we need to understand these real stories. It's just, why is that the story that gets told over and over? Like, what is the fascination with seeing us die? What is the fascination with seeing us get raped and killed again and again? And I'm just really interested in that intersection for a non-trans audience. Like, that's where we get our audience. That's the only way we can get an audience, is through pity and victimhood. And so that's what I have a lot of difficulty with that film. And I also have a lot of difficulty with the erasure of the black man who was also killed that night in the real story, Philip Devine. And so and all of the films, actually, there's a lot to talk about with all of the films, and we try to be really nuanced in our approach to everything.
You point out that man is not in
He's not
the film.
in the film.
It was because it's based on the true story of Brandon Teena.
It's based on the true story.
But an African-American man was also murdered that night.
3 people were murdered that night, and the film only addresses the 2 white people. And so I think that's, yeah, I don't have the proper word to say on air for that. But the film...
Yance Ford, do you have the proper word?
This is the internet, right?
It is not. Well, I mean, it is, but we're also on television.
I mean, it is, again, I loved Boys Don't Cry. I loved it. But to realize that Philip Devine was erased from that story, that his death did not matter enough to the filmmakers to include it in that film, is another act of violence, right? It is erasing him as if he didn't matter, but then it is also telling every black trans person, every black gay person, every black ally that your death does not matter, that your presence in this person's life and your being an ally to that person did not matter. And I think that one of the things that directors have to do is to be more conscious. Like, I think we have to live in the moment of our creation and understand what we're doing when we make choices like that. You can't just wipe someone out of history. He was there, and he's not here now, just like Brandon Teena. And the more people begin to understand the impact of their decisions creatively, and the more people realize by watching Disclosure that the accumulation of 100 years of these types of choices have on a community, like have on actual human beings, hopefully, for me, that will move people to be smarter, more empathetic, and more deliberate about their decision making. Because erasing him is just, I mean, it's an act of violence, but it's also just lazy.
Well, you say in the film, in this very touching moment among an endless stream of deeply moving moments, if we can't see us, we can't be us.
You know, the wonderful thing about Marian Wright Edelman is that she has such wisdom across, across the range of human experience. When she said that about children, I don't think that she would exclude trans children or gender nonconforming children or children who feel like they are non-binary. She means all of us when she says that. And I think that to have us be homicide victims, or to be rape victims, or to be exposed in a violent way and then discarded, we don't need to see any more of that. We see that every day.
Jen Richards.
What interests me, that I just realized as we're talking, that there's a parallel between The Danish Girl and The Boys Don't Cry, and that both are trans stories that are written and directed and performed by cis people for a cis audience. And in both cases, the complexity of the actual situation is erased in favor of something that's more easy to package. In the case of The Danish Girl, Lily Elbe was this incredibly kind of daring, progressive woman, and it was clear that her and her wife were always in a lesbian relationship, because her wife went on to do erotic lesbian painting for the rest of their life. They lived happily as a lesbian couple for many years, and it was only after 6 surgeries that Lily Elbe eventually did die, because she was always pushing the boundaries of medical science, and that they were operating in this pre-war, very artistic kind of queer culture at the time. And so all that complexity is lost, and instead we have this story of this man who has to become a woman, and then his wife, leaves him for this, strapping Austrian guy. And so we erase all the actual queerness of it. And again, it reinforces this historical forgetting, as if queer people hadn't always been around.
I want to turn to another clip from this remarkable documentary that's just premiered at Sundance called Disclosure, where Laverne Cox discusses portrayals of trans people in the media. It begins with the comedian Flip Wilson playing that famous character Geraldine on The Flip Wilson Show.
Hit it, maestro. All of me. Why not take all of me? Can't you see I'm no good without you?
What's interesting for me about growing up in Mobile, Alabama, and then having my first interactions with what it meant to be transgender happening on television is that even when characters weren't necessarily trans-identified, I think those characters affected how I thought of myself as a trans person and how the general public probably thinks about trans people. And one of those early images for me was the character of Geraldine from The Flip Wilson Show. I remember I would watch it with my mom and my brother, and my mother loved Geraldine and would laugh at that character, so it's something that existed in the realm of humor. But whenever there was something trans this or sex change that...
A sex change operation. A sex change operation.
Right.
I better sit down.
I would be very interested, and I would sort of lean in, but very sort of discreetly. These images that don't seem to comport with, like, the person that I knew I was. And so everything that was trans about me, it made me just hate.
Yet another clip from Disclosure, and that, of course, is Laverne Cox, who is the famous actress as a trans woman who is also one of the executive producers of this documentary, Disclosure. Yance Ford, as we go through this history, take it to today, the significance of media representation and whether you think there is hope, where you see it changing in the most important ways and what you want to see.
Sure. I am hopeful because there are so many trans young people who are aspiring filmmakers, directors, writers, actors, who are not asking permission to enter into these professions. They are not asking for anyone's approval to pursue their dreams. And so when I see these kids and they ask me about filmmaking or documentary filmmaking, they don't realize that they are giving me the gift of hope. Because I know that after my lifetime, these kids will be the ones to reverse this 100-year history that Disclosure lays out so well and so in such an incredible manner for us all to watch. The next 100 years of cinema are going to be written by trans makers. They're going to be written by trans actors and writers and directors, and that, for me, is an incredible feeling to know that another generation of trans kids will not have to ingest the things that I did when I was growing up and then live out the effects of that over the course of their lifetime.
Sam Feder, you're the director of Disclosure. You have a remarkable statistic in the film. What is it, something like 80%?
Approximately 80% of Americans say they don't think they've ever met a trans person. They actually probably have. They just don't know it. And so that means that everything they know about trans people comes from film and television.
And that's why it is so critical, which takes us to Chase Strangio. Chase, you work on legislation all over this country. Right now, we're talking about what's happening in South Dakota and in states around the country that are introducing anti-trans legislation. And when it doesn't pass the first time, they do it again. Can you talk about, as you're featured in the film as well, Disclosure, the connection between media representations and the laws that are put into place or fought back against all over this country?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think this film is such a critical intervention in every aspect of the ways that power is working to erase, diminish, and attack trans people. And I see it all the time. I travel around the country fighting back against legislation. I litigate cases. We were just before the United States Supreme Court arguing against the Trump administration's position that LGBTQ people and trans people in particular shouldn't be protected under federal law. And there you could see, even knowing that there were trans people in the courtroom, you had, justices from Justice Gorsuch to Justice Sotomayor really not being able to imagine trans existence outside those very tropes that we see on film and television. And Justice Gorsuch said something at argument in the Title VII cases in October along the lines of, well, wouldn't it be disruptive to include trans people in society? And that sense of disruption is him superimposing the images that he's likely seen from film and television that this film really does confront us with, and putting that over even the trans people like myself who are sitting there right before him. And we have to do the work of teaching people what they have already been told, and then allowing our trans bodies, our trans voices, and our trans selves to undo all of that work that has been done against us all these years. And disclosure is critical in that, in the fight in legislatures, in Congress, and before the courts.
Chase, the film highlights the media's complicity and involvement in sensationalizing and diminishing trans people and their stories. There's an amazing clip with Katie Couric and Oprah Winfrey. Can you talk about the role, how that translates into even the work that you do?
Yeah, there's this idea that the trans person is always something to be, laughed at, something to be dissected and explored, something, a person whose body is open to public debate. This idea that we could look at someone and ask them about their genitals and then laugh at them is the very thing that authorizes lawmakers to think that it is in our best interest to constrain the ability for us to survive in our bodies. So the media's mocking of us, the media's insistence that they not teach themselves about how we exist in the world is the very thing that it's really the natural progression into the legislation that we're seeing. And so I think we all have a responsibility to tell more accountable stories and contend with our bodies in ways that treat us with just basic human dignity.
I want to end with Jen Richards and your work as a writer, as an actress, where you see the rays of hope are right now and the kind of work that you're doing and that you're seeing other people doing, the openings. And would you consider it a victory if people didn't even say trans actress?
I love that we're focusing on that as well, because that's an important pairing with the critique, is to applaud the things that are done well. And you're a fan of Tales of the City, and I think that's a really wonderful contemporary example of a show that had trans directors, trans writers, trans consultants, trans actors, and what we then see is a really complicated, nuanced portrayal of trans lives and diverse kinds of trans lives. I think a lot about an email I got from a mom who had to tell me that she watched her trans daughter sit on the floor and watch my episode of Tales of the City 3 times in a row, back to back. And I think about what impact that will have on that child, that they get to see that, and that's the image, and those are the kinds of stories that will carry her forward into her life. So I'm thrilled that those kinds of things are beginning to happen more and more frequently, and it's because of conversations like we've been having behind the scenes over the last decade, and will now be brought forward into the public through Sam's film.
Jen Richards, Oscar-nominated director Yance Ford, ACLU lawyer Chase Strangio, and Sam Thader, the director of Disclosure, Trans Lives on Screen. That does it for our show. I'm speaking today at 2 p.m. at the Park City Museum on Main Street. Special thanks to our crew here at Park City TV, Danielle Turner, Parker Martin, Diego Romo, Jacqueline Dele, and Yeribia and Ethan Barrios, and our amazing Democracy Now! Crew here in Utah and in New York. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us from Park City, Utah.